You have said that Virginia has a lot of scar tissue when it comes to race, but it feels on many of these issues that it's very much an open wound. What has actually changed since Charlottesville?
I think what's changed is Charlottesville was shocking. It was shocking that, you know, a local guy like a Jason Kessler would call this Unite the Right rally, and it was shocking that people from out of state would come in and
he was a UVA grad.
He's a local guy, but most of the people arrested for violence that day were out-of-staters who came in to bring their hatred and bigotry, and that was shocking. And what I see that has changed a good bit in Virginia, Margaret, is people standing up and saying, we're not going to let our state be defined this way. Energetic activism. It was seen most directly in the Virginia elections in November of 2017. We elected a statewide ticket, including the second African-American elected a statewide office, Justin Fairfax. Democrats elected more members of the lower legislative house than in any year since the 1870s. And who was elected? Of the 15 people that got elected with this energetic turnout, 11 of the 15 were women, African-American, Asian-American, Latino-American, immigrant-born, LGBT, transgender. It was a real rainbow coalition of who the Virginia of today is.
And yet Corey Stewart, the man running against you, wants to protect Confederate monuments and take back our heritage. That's countering what you're describing.
Yeah, it is, but again, look who won last year. It wasn't, in the most recent elections we had, it wasn't the people who want to secede or go backwards who were winning elections. They can run. But who won in the most recent election in Virginia were a group of people saying, and I think really energized by what they saw in Charlottesville, to say, we are a state, Virginia is for lovers, we're a state that believes in equality, we're a state that really wants to be a commonwealth, a community. So Charlottesville was a shock, and what I think it has created is an energy of people of goodwill standing up and saying, there will not be hate. Hate will not define who we are. We're on a path of progress, and we're going to stay there.
Well, some optimism coming out of this.
Yeah, I feel, pain has inspired energy, and energy is breeding optimism. I believe that. When
you were mayor of Richmond, though, you dealt with some of these questions about how to represent the Confederacy here. This was the capital of the Confederacy.
Right.
Does it trouble you that those monuments are still standing?
It doesn't trouble me that they're still standing. It means we have to always be in dialogue about our history and the right way to represent them. So just, talking about—
What does that mean?
We have to be in dialogue about how we portray who Richmond has been, is, and will be. And what I learned when I was mayor, and when I was lieutenant governor and governor, is there's sort of two lessons that are important. The quality of, as you're thinking about history and how to portray it, the quality of the listening you do does determine the acceptability of the result you find.
This was the rallying point, though, last year for the Unite the Right rally, was the question of the removal of Robert E. Lee from Charlottesville.
That was not it, Margaret. I want to challenge you on that. Charlottesville was not about statues. It was about hatred. It was about bigotry and division. This was not a Save the Statue rally. It was a Unite the Right rally. The people who were arrested for violence largely came from out of state, coming here. Statues don't make you march around chanting, "Jews will not replace us." They don't make you say "blood and soil" or other slogans from Nazi youth rallies. I think the thing that's important about Charlottesville is to say it's about statues kind of diminishes the gravity of it. It was about hatred. It was about bigotry. It was about people who have hateful views that sadly have been stoked in this environment, descending on Charlottesville to try to make a point, murdering a paralegal, causing the deaths of 2 state troopers, both of whom that I knew. And so it was a monstrous, monstrous event. We have to grapple with our history, and its statues, its buildings like this. This was an amazing building we're sitting in that was built as an armory for African-American soldiers in the 1890s because they couldn't go to the 4 armories in town that were for white soldiers. And so we have history all around us. But, I think the way you think about your history, it's an ongoing dialogue. My mayor right now, Mayor Stoney, is grappling with statue questions in Richmond, just as I did when I was mayor 20 years ago. But the bigger issue is, with Charlottesville, is it was about hatred. And that is what we need to stand up against here.
You've said in the past it should be additive. That's what you're talking about, not subtractive. But when we spoke to the mayor of Charlottesville, her point was, it may not be about a statue, but that statue symbolizes, in her view, white supremacy.
Sure, sure.
Do you think that's what it represents?
Well, if you look at some of the statues, I think different statues have different meaning, but look at some of the statues. Many of them were put up by governments, could have been a city council, could have been a state, at a time before the Voting Rights Act, when African Americans couldn't vote, when African Americans weren't in elected office. So even the decision of a body to say, look, we want to recognize this person, when African Americans couldn't even participate in the decision making, yeah, they look at that and say, hold on a second, had we had a seat at the table, had we been allowed to participate, the statues that are in Richmond or Charlottesville or anywhere might be very, very different. That's a very valid point. So I do think that the two lessons that we really always grapple with here are, make sure you're listening to your community, the community of today, not the community of 100 years ago. Listen to your community. And it's not just about subtraction, it's also about addition. So when I was mayor, for example, we did take down some things named after Confederate generals. We had 2 bridges that were named after generals that were very old, needed to be replaced. We took them down, and when we rebuilt them, we named them after civil rights heroes. We also preserved some history, including statues of Confederates on Monument Avenue. We built new statues, Arthur Ashe, Maggie Walker, a civil rights memorial on Capitol Square. We reclaimed parts of our history, like this armory that was shuttered and closed and now is reopened as a Black History Museum. So it's kind of an all-encompassing proposition of taking some things down and adding things and renaming things, taking advantage of opportunities. If you have a building like a court building that's just called the Family Court Building, why not name it the Oliver Hill Court Building to honor prominent civil rights lawyers? So officials, I think, Mayor Charlottesville is grappling with this in a good way. My mayor in Richmond now is grappling with it. If you're in dialogue with your community about it to try to figure out what is the right way to represent who we are today, that's good. If you say a decision was made by a body a long time ago and nobody can ever question it or change it, that's bad.
Are you saying it's just unrealistic in the state of Virginia to think that Confederate monuments should all be removed?
Well, I say let the decision makers decide. I mean, again, I think the mayor and the city council in Charlottesville or Richmond should be able to listen to their community and make those decisions. And I wouldn't presume to tell everybody what the right decision is. I think, you know, I mean, one of the things we did once when I was mayor is we built a big flood wall along the James River, and there was an issue about, the word came out, we were going to put murals on the flood wall because gray concrete's not that nice. We were going to put all these murals about the city's history printed on fabric. And one of the murals had a representation of Robert E. Lee on it. And one of my city council members raised, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. And here's what we did. We put all the murals up in our convention center for a week. And we said, just come and look at them and see what you think. And I think people realized there was a difference between a big mural of Robert E. Lee and a dozen murals with dozens of figures from the city's history, one of whom was Robert E. Lee. One is sort of telling who we are, the good, the bad, the challenging, the tough. Another way it might have been a glorification, and I think people realized, okay, you see, is the full history told? People felt more comfortable with it. And I think that is what so many of our cities in the South generally have to focus on. Are we telling our full history, or is there just a glorification of a particular part of our history? And that's why the addition thing, I think, is such an important element, not the only element, but it's a really important element to this.
Should there be subtraction from the U.S. Capitol? Should Robert E. Lee's statue still be there?
Here's what I think. The rule in the Capitol is every state gets 2 statues in Statuary Hall. Virginia has George Washington and Robert E. Lee. Here are the Here are the rules about how the statues get in. Each state gets to pick 2. You get to pick your own statue. The Capitol architect has to approve the design. And here's an important rule. And you can't change out a statue unless it's been there at least 10 years. So the idea was that it wouldn't always be fixed in time. That a state over the course of its history might decide we'll recognize this person for a while and this person for another time. I think the Lee statue was put in by Virginia in around 1908.
Is it time to take it down?
I think if you're looking at the whole scope of Virginia history, you know, 1619, the English, but even before 1619 with Virginia Indians, I think it would be a great time to analyze, okay, has anything happened since 1908 that might make us think of should there be a different statue? And since the whole design of the Statuary Hall was to allow change over time as states kind of grapple with, hey, who we want to honor, I think there are a lot of other people that we might want to honor there.
So it sounds like you're saying definitely time.
I think, yeah, and the legislature has to make that call, but I think that would be very appropriate.
Nationwide now, you know, there's a lot of conversation generally about race, but from President Trump himself, he makes the argument that the unemployment rate, the jobless rate for the African American community is at a record low. He frequently cites that statistic to make the point that he's improving lives for the African American community and for minorities. Do you think he has created real opportunity?
No, I think he's been a failure. The unemployment rate is low generally. That's good. It was coming down when he took office. That's good. So I give him that. He doesn't get all the credit for it because it was coming down significantly when he took office. But how about gaps in income? They are significant. How about gaps in wealth? They are significant. And what I think I'm most concerned about with this president is his penchant to divide us, to attack people because they're immigrants, to attack people because of their religion, to attack minorities, to use vulgar language to describe countries where people come who might be Latino or African. There is a concerted effort that he has been engaged in to divide people, including dividing them based on race. And nowhere was that more obvious, nowhere, than in the aftermath of Charlottesville. When somebody drove a car into a crowd in Columbus, Ohio, between his election and when he was inaugurated, and that somebody happened to be somebody from the Middle East, he called it terrorism and went to Columbus to comfort families who had been injured. When somebody of a Middle Eastern background drove a car into a crowd in Barcelona, he called it terrorism. But when this happened in Charlottesville, 90 miles from the White House, in the home of an archetypal American president, suddenly he says, well, you know, there's good people on both sides. He could not distinguish who was on the right side and who was on the wrong side in a white supremacist neo-Nazi rally. And that was infuriating. Virginians really saw that for what it was, because a state that's been scarred like we have, with the divisions of racism and hatred and slavery in the past, when we have a president who can't call it out, it was outrageous. And so, no, I think he has stoked division. I think he has stoked these fears of hatred. He didn't create them. The people who came to Charlottesville to demonstrate their hatred, they, I'm sure, had those emotions before there was a President Trump. But he's stoking it. And I think that's very, very damning that he does that.
Why do you think that? Why do you think he's stoking that? Do you think he's racist?
I don't know him. I do not know him. I have no idea about who he is as a person. So whether it's a sincere feeling or whether he thinks it gets him some political edge or gain, I don't know the answer, but I don't know which of those two is worse. If it's not your view, but you do it to try to get a political edge and you try to stoke division, in some ways that's every bit as morally bad as holding views that are bigoted or racist.
With this debate over culture war issues or identity politics, you hear from both parties. Do you think that embracing this idea of identity politics is something that Democrats like yourself should be doing?
I don't call it identity politics. I know there's a critique that for Dems it's identity politics or it's political correctness. Here's what I say, it's equality. Jefferson put equality into the Declaration of Independence as America's North Star. Now, he was an imperfect person. He couldn't live it, but at least he was far-sighted enough to see we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal is the first truth. Jefferson founded the modern Democratic Party. Lincoln founded the modern Republican Party. At Gettysburg, he stands up and says, 77 years ago, our fathers conceived on this continent a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He took Jefferson's self-evident truths, equality was number one, and turned it into one proposition, the equality proposition. So what we need to be about, not just as Democrats, but about Americans, we got to be true to our North Star. We got to be true to the equality principle. And we have to reject division and embrace equality. That's not identity politics. That's not political correctness. That's being true to the fundamental Virginia and American value that equality is the North Star we should pursue.
But advisors to the president, past advisors like Steve Bannon, have said the more Democrats talk and focus on issues of identity, issues of race, that it's a political benefit because the message is we're about actually improving people's lives, economic nationalism, and that's going to continue to win for Republicans.
I'm not telling any Republican or any elected official what to say, but what I am saying is, as a nation, if we're not committed to equality, what are we committed to? I mean, we are somewhat of a unique nation in that way, in that we really set that out as our North Star. And Margaret, you can look at our whole history, from the Declaration of Independence to today, as a human, very human struggle by imperfect people to, can we approach and be more like what we said we would be? I mean, just look at our history. Declaration of Independence, that language about all men are created equal is one of the most known phrases in the English language, 1776. 11 years later, 1787, a constitution doesn't mention the word equality at all. Enshrines inequality, slavery. We have to fight a war over the equality principle. After the Civil War is over and blood has been shed, as Lincoln said, sort of in the expiation of the sin of all the blood that was shed by slaves. That was how he viewed the Civil War. We changed the Constitution to require equality now. Right after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But then we battle over, Jim Crow, and we battle over school desegregation, but then we make advances. And every generation finds its own advances. We advance on racial equality in the 1870s by changing the Constitution, but don't let women vote. And then we have to come back in 1919 and 1920. Well, wait a minute, equality means women should vote. Well, and then this generation's equality is, wow, people should be able to marry who they love and not be blocked because of their sexual orientation. So we have this North Star that's out before us. And the way I look at it, it's like if you're a sailor, you can orient by the North Star. You might never get there. We're imperfect people. We may never get to equality in the pure sense of it, but that's got to be our North Star. And if somebody says, oh, that's identity politics or that's political correctness, you just say, no, if we're not for equality as a nation, what are we? Of course we are. That's the very foundation of who we are.
Does that extend to the criminal justice system? Your Democratic colleague, Elizabeth Warren, says it's 100% racist, front to back.
There are deep, deep challenges. Does it extend to?
You agree with her?
Oh, there are systemic racial inequities in the criminal justice system, absolutely. So when I'm saying we have this policy, we're not living it perfectly in any sphere. Criminal justice, I think, would be one where there's significant problems. Look at the disproportionate incarceration rates. Now, to say the entire system is racist, hey, I know fantastic, professionals, law enforcement professionals, judges, prosecutors who are doing their best every day to reduce inequality. But if you just look at the results, the outcome, who is incarcerated, I'll give you an example that's a really important one right now. We're suffering through a tremendous opioid addiction crisis. And you know what? The opioid crisis, because it is like no respecter of race, region, or wealth, and people are succumbing to it everywhere, I think society is starting to have a reaction, wow, this is a public health emergency. We have to deal with it that way. But we've dealt with addiction for a very long time. People who are addicted to crack or to meth or others, were just branded as criminals. Now that there's an opioid issue, people are broadening their horizon and looking at it as a public health issue. I know a lot of communities that say, hey, I wish you thought it was a public health issue when it was crack or something else. So I think opioid is a great example of our eyes are being opened to the fact that addiction issues need to be dealt with not just with the hard edge of criminal law, but need to be dealt with also in the sense of prevention and treatment. But that should be beyond opioid to any addiction issue.
What about another question around all of this is how we police ourselves and the language that's used.
Yeah, good.
Alex Jones just this week had a number of different tech companies, social media companies decide to pull down his content. One of the issues being discussed there was what happened in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
Do you think that it should be the role of these social media companies to police themselves?
Absolutely. And I think we need reasonable regulation as well, but you have to do it.
Because Twitter said shouldn't be our job. That should be up to journalists.
I think that they have a responsibility, especially if their business model involves them making money, which all of these companies are making money, and they take advantage of hateful or violent rhetoric to make money, they need to be held responsible for that. And if they're not willing to...
Who holds them responsible for
that?
that?
Well, ultimately, courts and the government. And so you see in the Alex Jones case, he's in court right now with people who are challenging him for the statements that he's made that have either been emotionally damaging or even inciting to violence. And so a court system, you ought to have appropriate regulation. But I think that burden, of course, has to fall on the shoulders of companies. I don't think they can just make money off this kind of stuff and then say, oh, we don't have any responsibility to police it. That's an outrageous abdication of responsibility.
You have also, in speaking about these issues as open wounds, you have raised the issue of race and discrimination as directly tied to how the president discusses immigration as a national security threat.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that? Because he makes the case, this is just about security, this is just about stopping child traffickers, and he's about rule of law.
Yeah, but he really doesn't. He uses vulgar language. I don't want to repeat it. I don't want to repeat it on your show. He used vulgar language to describe certain countries. And the countries he was talking about are countries like Honduras, where I worked as a missionary, or Haiti, where my campaign manager's parents came from. That vulgar language tells you what's really in his heart. He uses unfair stereotypes. Mexicans are rapists and criminals. I mean, give me a break. He will suggest that everybody who comes to the border is a member of MS-13. Give me a break. I mean, the statistics show that that's not true. So when somebody perpetuates a stereotype that's false, you have to ask, why are they doing that? And I think he is stoking division, and it's against folks from, third world countries, folks whose skin color are different than his, folks whose religion he doesn't approve of.
Yet the Supreme Court upheld the travel ban that was predominantly applied to Muslim-majority countries.
Yeah, but the Supreme Court also chastened his language in describing it. Justice Kennedy and others said, hey, look, this language is really inappropriate. They upheld version 3 after version 1 was struck down. Mm-hmm. After version 2 was struck down, they finally did a version that could limp across the finish line in the Supreme Court by a 5-4 vote. But even in that approval, the court called out the president's language. I mean, look, the burden that's on the shoulder of any of us in leadership now is to try to pull this country together, not divide people. I've been kind of obsessed with the Pledge of Allegiance recently. I guess maybe because the last 2 words in it, for all. We have our kids say this pledge every day to a flag. And Francis Bellamy was the minister who wrote in the 1890s. And he kind of was about a social movement. Write a pledge, have kids say it every day in every classroom, in every school, all across the country, and have a flag on the wall that they would say it to. And he could have had the pledge in, one nation under God. That was added in the 1950s, indivisible, with liberty and justice, period. And that would have been a good pledge. But it was so much better when he added the 2 words at the end, with liberty and justice for all, because that really expresses who we are. And what I challenge the president on is I don't think he's behaving like a for all guy. He is behaving in a way that divides people from one another. And we got to have leaders at all levels who stand up and make plain that we are a for-all nation, a for-all commonwealth.
He's made some of this personal because he's endorsing the man running against you for your
no
current
surprise.
Senate seat.
Yeah.
Attacked you on Twitter and endorsed Corey Stewart, who says he wants to help take back our heritage in the state of Virginia. Mm-hmm. What does that say to you?
Well, it says that there is a clear choice for Virginians.
He wants to protect Confederate monuments. Well, this is an election issue.
He said that. He also said that that Virginia was right to secede in 1861. Here's what I think. When I talk to Virginians, they're interested in 2018. They're much more interested in 2018 than they are in 1861. So I'm interested very much in not take anything back, going back. I've seen what back looks like, and I want to go forward. And I think that's what the election is about. Are we going forward? Are we going forward together? Or are we going backward to a more divisive time? And I think that's what is going to end up. That's going to be the main question in my race. And yeah, the president is on the side of the guy who wants to go back, but I'm on the side of people who want to go forward. And I think Virginians want to go forward.